Hello, I'm Helen Koumidi. I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist in Greece. In this video, I'll try to explain psychologically the differentiation between individual and mass suicide, taking as example the mass suicide of the members of the Heaven's Gate cult. I was 16 years old when this mass suicide happened, and I remember that I couldn't understand why some people decide altogether to commit suicide with happy mood. Usually we think that a person who wants to finish his life is really sad. But the members of this cult were smiling just before their suicidal act. So it was a smiley mass suicide. First of all, let's remember the story. On March 26, 1997, the police discovered 39 dead bodies, all members of the Heaven's Gate cult. They claimed they were extraterrestrial beings and believed that the Earth would be recycled, so it was vital for them to immediately abandon the planet. That year, the leader of the Heaven's Gate cult anticipated the passage of the comet Hale-Bopp near the Earth, and he predicted that the UFO would follow the comet's tail. The members believed that by committing suicide, their souls would reach up the flying saucer. They followed the leader's delirium, and the mass suicide took place in a ritual way. As members of the crew of a spaceship, they wore the same uniform with the label Heaven's Gate Away Team, then swallowed the pills and lay down. I'll try to answer these psychological questions. Firstly, what is the difference between an individual and a mass suicide? Secondly, how can we explain psychologically the mass suicide of the members of the Heaven's Gate cult? To answer these questions, I'll use Freud's theory. Freud's theory is always a useful tool for explaining psychological situations. So rereading Freud will help us understand a little bit more about this strange psychological phenomenon. I will start with the examination of the individual suicide. A suicide is an act of killing oneself. This act shows us a change in the person's state of mind and soul. This change led this person to commit suicide. How can we explain this psychological change? Freud referred to melancholia as the psychological disorder that can provoke suicide. So we could explain individual suicide if we use Freud's theory of melancholia. In his text Mourning and Melancholia, Freud noted that the analysis of melancholia can show us the reason why a person commits suicide. The ego can kill itself only if, owing to the return of the object cathexis, it can treat itself as an object. If it is able to direct against itself the hostility which relates to an object and represents the ego's original reaction to objects in the external world. In the text The Libido Theory and Narcissism, Freud refers to the melancholic person who has withdrawn his libido from the object, but that by a process which we must call narcissistic identification, the object has been set up in the ego itself, has been as it were projected onto the ego. The subject's own ego is then treated like the object that has been abandoned, and it is subjected to all the acts of aggression and expressions of vengefulness which have been aimed at the object. A melancholic's propensity to suicide is also made more intelligible if we consider that the patient's embitterment strikes with a single blow at his own ego and at the loved and hated object. In the text, The Ego and the Id, Freud refers to the object that has been put inside the ego, describing its mechanism, introjection. Freud clarifies further the melancholic state with a new concept of superego. The ego ideal becomes a function of superego. In melancholia, the object to which the superego's wrath applies has been taken into the ego through identification. Freud's question was, how is it that the superego manifests itself essentially as a sense of guilt and moreover develops such extraordinary harshness and severity towards the ego? Freud's answer was, if we turn to melancholia first, we find that the excessively strong superego, which has obtained a hold up on consciousness, rages against the ego with merciless violence, as if it had taken possession of the whole of the sadism available in the person concerned. In melancholia, the ego gives itself up because it feels itself hated and persecuted by the superego instead of loved. To the ego, therefore, living means the same as being loved by the superego, which here again appears as the representative of the id. The superego fulfills the same function of protecting and saving that was fulfilled in earlier days by the father and later by providence or destiny. But when the ego finds itself in an excessive real danger, which it believes itself unable to overcome by its own strength, it is bound to draw the same conclusion. It seems itself deserted by all protecting forces and lets itself die. In melancholia, the superego, the nuclear of the first identifications with the parents, attacks the ego of the subject. The superego derives from a transformation of the child's earliest object cathexis into identifications, and it takes the place of the Oedipus complex. It's the mechanism of the replacement of an object cathexis by an identification and the introjection of the former object. Freud emphasized that the superego may have a compulsive character, which manifests itself in the form of a categorical imperative and retains the character of the father. The superego is, however, not simply a residue of the earliest object choices of the id. It also represents an energetic reaction formation against those choices. Its relation to the ego is not exhausted by the precept, you ought to be like this, like your father. It also comprises the prohibition, you may not be like this, like your father. That is, you may not do all that he does. Some things are his prerogative. Freud describes briefly the definition of an individual's suicide in the text, The Psychogenesis of a Case of Homosexuality in a Woman. For analysis has explained the enigma of suicide in the following way. Probably no one finds the mental energy required to kill himself unless, in the first place, in doing so, he is at the same time killing an object with whom he has identified himself and, in the second place, is turning against himself a death wish which had been directed against someone else. Now we can summarize the psychological process of an individual suicide. The psychological disorder here is depression, an individual neurosis or psychosis. The psychological mechanism is narcissistic identification, introjection. A person identifies himself with the abandoned object. He becomes then the abandoned object. He abandons himself and his life. we have a change of libidinal situation from narcissistic self-love to self-reproaches. The superego of the subject commands the destruction of the ego. The ego becomes the object that must be destroyed. I must be destroyed, this person thinks. There is a suicidal act which is characterized by a feeling of sadness. Love has been lost. His suicide is an act of abandoned love, a loss of love. So an individual suicide here comes as a result of depression. We continue with the examination of a mass suicide. A mass suicide constitutes a special kind of suicide. It takes place when a group of people jointly decides to suicide. The subject is directive with the other members of the group to commit suicide after the commandment of their leader. Freud analyzed the psychology of a person as a member of a group. So we could explain mass suicide if we use Freud's theory of group psychology. In the text, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Freud noted that an individual in a group is subjected through its influence to what is often a profound alteration in his mental activity. So, a group can change you. But how? How can we explain the group mind? Libido is the concept that Freud uses to explain the group mind. I shall make an attempt at using the concept of libido for the purpose of throwing light upon group psychology. Libido is an expression taken from the theory of emotions. We call by that the energy of those instincts which have to do with all that may be comprised under the word love. The nucleus of what we mean by love naturally consists in sexual love with sexual union as its aim. But we do not separate from this, on the one hand, self-love and, on the other, love for parents and children, friendship, and love for humanity in general, and also devotion to concrete objects and to abstract ideas. Freud emphasized the fact that these instincts may transform their aim. In relations between the sexes, these impulses force their way towards sexual union, but in other circumstances, they are diverted from this aim or are prevented from reaching it, though always preserving enough of their original nature to keep their identity recognizable, as in such features as the longing for proximity and self-sacrifice. So, according to Freud, love relationships constitute the essence of the group mind. We will try our fortune then with the supposition that love relationships, or to use a more neutral expression, emotional ties, also constitute the essence of the group mind. Let us remember that the authorities make no mention of any such relations. What would correspond to them is evidently concealed behind the shelter, the screen of suggestion. Our hypothesis finds support to the first instance from two passing thoughts. First, that a group is clearly held together by a power of some kind, and to what power could this feat be better ascribed than to Eros, which holds together everything in the world? Secondly, that if an individual gives up his distinctiveness in a group and lets other members influence him, by suggestion, it gives one the impression that he does it because he feels the need of being in harmony with them rather than in opposition to them. So that perhaps after all he does it for love of them. Libido is a concept that we could call it umbrella concept, because it includes the energy of every kind of love relationships. This energy can be transformed, and the characteristic of transformation provokes the changes inside a person's soul. People unconsciously don't want to change for others. In the contrary, they want the others to change and to become as they are. Freud had noted, in the undisguised antipathies and aversions which people feel towards strangers with whom they have to do, we may recognize the expression of self-love, of narcissism. This self-love works for the preservation of the individual and behaves as though the occurrence of any divergence from his own particular lines of development involved a criticism of them and a demand for their alteration. So long as a group formation persists, or so far as it extends, individuals in the group behave as though they were uniform, tolerate the peculiarities of its other members, equate themselves with them, and have no feeling of aversion towards them. Such a limitation of narcissism can, according to our theoretical views, only be produced by one factor: a libidinal tie with other people. Love for oneself knows only one barrier: love for others, love for objects. The libido attaches itself to the satisfaction of the great vital needs, and chooses as its first objects the people who have a share in that process. And in the development of mankind as a whole, just as in individuals, love alone acts as the civilizing factor in the sense that it brings a change from egoism to altruism. If therefore in groups narcissistic self-love is subject to limitations which do not operate outside them, that is cogent evidence that the essence of a group formation consists in new kinds of libidinal ties among the members of the group. For Freud, the concept identification is one of the most important concepts in psychoanalysis. Identification is known to psychoanalysis as the earliest expression of an emotional tie with another person. It plays a part in the early history of the Oedipus complex. First, identification is the original form of emotional tie with an object. Secondly, in a regressive way, it becomes a substitute for a libidinal object tie, as it were by means of introjection of the object into the ego. And thirdly, it may arise with any new perception of a common quality shared with some other person who is not an object of the sexual instinct. We already begin to divine that the mutual tie between members of a group is in the nature of an identification of this kind, based upon an important emotional common quality. And we may suspect that this common quality lies in the nature of the tie with the leader. The formula that Freud gave for the libidinal constitution of groups with a leader was the following. A primary group of this kind is a number of individuals who have put one and the same object in the place of their ego ideal and have consequently identified themselves with one another in their ego. We can see here Freud's graphic representation for the libidinal constitution of groups. Freud also emphasized the fact that apart from the influence of the suggestion of the leader, there is a mutual suggestion from one person to another. The influence of suggestion becomes a greater riddle for us when we admit that it is not exercised only by the leader, but by every individual upon every other individual. and we must reproach ourselves with having unfairly emphasized the relation to the leader and with having kept the other factor of mutual suggestion too much in the background. But despite this mutual suggestion, Freud also noted that every individual can find his own originality. Each individual is a component part of numerous groups. He is bound by ties of identification in many directions, and he has built up his ego ideal upon the most various models. Each individual, therefore, has a share in numerous group minds, those of his race, of his class, of his creed, of his nationality, etc., and he can also raise himself above them to the extent of having a scrap of independence and originality. It means that we are never fully dependent from the others. Certainly, we are responsible for our identifications. These identifications build our character. They bond us with the others. They are our choices, but also choices can change. It is also important to mention that Freud repeats in the text the section of the personality, the definition of the libidinal constitution of groups, using the word superego in place of the word ego ideal. In 1921, I endeavored to make use of the differentiation between the ego and the superego in a study of group psychology. I arrived at a formula such as this. A psychological group is a collection of individuals who have introduced the same person into their superego and, on the basis of this common element, have identified themselves with one another in their ego. It means that Freud gave more attention to the importance of the superego in the group psychology. Freud also was referred to the psychology of believing in the text The Future of an Illusion. Believing in someone or something is a result of these psychological needs, human wishes. 1. Psychological need for answers to questions about human being, who am I, what is the meaning of life, etc. And 2. Psychological need for protection and love from a powerful father. For this belief, he uses the word illusion, but he also noted that some ideas may be more delusional than others in relation to their relation to reality. What is characteristic of illusion is that they are derived from human wishes. In this respect, they come near to psychiatric delusions, but they differ from them too, apart from the more complicated structure of delusions. In the case of delusions, we emphasize as essential their being as in contradiction with reality. Illusions need not necessarily be false, that is to say, unrealizable or in contradiction to reality. Freud emphasized in his text, Civilization and its Discontents, the fact that people use many ways to avoid psychological pain. Illusions is one of the ways we use to tolerate reality. The region from which these illusions arise is the life of the imagination at the time when the development of the sense of reality took place. This region was expressly exempted from the demands of reality testing and was set apart for the purpose of fulfilling wishes which were difficult to carry out. Each one of us behaves in some one respect like a paranoid, corrects some aspect of the world which is unbearable to him by the construction of a wish and introduces this delusion into reality. A special importance attaches to the case in which this attempt to procure a certainty of happiness and a protection against suffering through a delusional remoulding of reality is made by a considerable number of people in common. So, according to Freud, illusions are one of the ways that people use for avoiding psychological pain. Our illusions, our delusions, our fantasies are made from human psychology to confront reality, to comfort from pain. What do people seek? Freud answers to that question. They want happiness, but happiness doesn't happen permanently. It's in human nature. Happiness can't last forever. What do they demand of life and wish to achieve in it? The answer to this can hardly be in doubt. They strive after happiness. They want to become happy and to remain so. What we call happiness in the strictest sense comes from the preferably sudden satisfaction of needs, which have been dammed up to a high degree, and it is from its nature only possible as an episodic phenomenon. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. Thus, our possibilities of happiness are already restricted by our constitution. Pain is in our human nature. Unhappiness is much less difficult to experience. We are threatened with suffering from three directions. From our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution, and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals. From the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction, and finally, from our relations to other men. The suffering which comes from this last source is perhaps more painful to us than any other. That is the fear of loss of love, or fear of the superego. At the beginning, therefore, what is bad is whatever causes one to be threatened with loss of love. In small children, it can never be anything else. But in many adults too, it has only changed to the extent that the place of the father or the two parents is taken by the larger human community. Love, again, is the answer. I am, of course, speaking of the way of life which makes love the center of everything, which looks for all satisfaction in loving and being loved. Now we can summarize the psychological process of a mass suicide. There is a psychological disorder with a mass illusion, a community neurosis. The psychological mechanism is hysterical identification. A person in a sect identifies himself with the leader. He becomes a follower. I must follow him. There is a change of libidinal situation, from narcissistic self-love to love for others. The superego of each member unites to a mass commandment of the group for a common purpose, mass salvation. There is suicidal act with a feeling of happiness. The love has been found and has to be retained. His suicide is an act of love for the leader and for the community. So a mass suicide here comes as a result of a mass illusion. Coming now to the example of the mass suicide of the Heaven's Gate cult. In Heaven's Gate cult, every member identified with each other, putting their ego ideal to the leader. So the leader became their superego. Whatever the leader commanded, the members wanted to accomplish it. They became his followers. Although the leader was delusional, the followers were not delusional. They believed in the same delusional idea of recreating their world. Each member believed him and identified with his words. They believed to another life. They shared a mass illusion. Mass suicide here comes as the end of a journey. Hence, it is an act inside the continual frame where the identification with the leader and the common ideal dominate. Consequently, for the members of this sect, there is no suicide. There is no death, only life somewhere else. "Let's go home," they said cheerfully. That's why the members of the Heaven's Gate were smiling before committing suicide. They did not believe that their action was suicidal. They weren't depressed. They were happy for the love they found, and they believed in a future new life together. Now, let's see the differentiation between individual and mass suicide with a table. We can see that individual and mass suicide have three common characteristics. 1. Common psychological need for love by the superego. 2. Common psychological mechanism of change identification. And 3. The superego commands the subject. And there are 4 differences between them. In an individual suicide, we have 1. A different type of identification, narcissistic identification. 2. A different change of libidinal situation from narcissistic self-love to self-reproaches. 3. Different topology of the superego, the command comes from inside the ego. And 4. Different feeling, sadness, the love has been lost. In a mass suicide, we have hysterical identification. We have a change from narcissistic self-love to love for others. We have a different topology of the superego. The command comes from outside the ego. It has been placed in the group. And a different feeling of happiness. The love has been found and has to be retained. Now we can summarize the psychological process of a mass suicide in a cult. A person who enters a cult can be mentally healthy. That person may randomly meet a member or a leader of a cult and listen to them. This meeting may trigger the psychological need of that person. That person may enter the cult searching to fulfill his psychological need for love, communication, and also answers to questions about the meaning of life and about himself, his personal identity. When that person starts to find answers, he identifies himself with the words of the leader and the members of the cult, feeling at the same time mental relief. Yes, that's who I am. He then becomes a follower. I must follow him. He believes in his new identity. This new identity leads to new rules of life. All members put their personal ideal superego to the leader, and this common ideal unites them. Each member needs psychologically to be loved by their personal superego. It means to follow their inner unconscious voice of their infantile identifications with their parents. You ought to be like this, for my love. The leader takes the place of their superego, the place of a father or God. He becomes their destiny, their law, and their savior. You must follow the rules of our community, and I will save you. The superego of each member unites to a mass commandment of the group for a common purpose, mass salvation. The love of the leader and the community becomes the personal salvation of each member. The mass suicide of the members becomes an act of love for the leader and the community. The members share a common feeling of happiness. Love has been found and has to be retained. All members share a community neurosis with a common symptom of a mass illusion. The common psychological need of love and a common belief in their leader may lead the members to commit suicide. Mass suicide comes as a result of a mass illusion. We could say that identification is the psychological mechanism that can change you. It is the process that can change the point of view and lead a person to a different state of mind, to an act even if it is an act of death. Our identifications reveal our character and our differences. It means that every person is constructed by the choices of identifications that he made. When we ask ourselves, why I chose this man or this woman, we have to ask, what characteristics do they have? These characteristics guided me to choose this particular love object, this man or this woman, and we can still ask ourselves, which is the origin of these characteristics and why I choose these particular characteristics? The answer comes from our past. Our parents, the persons that took care of us during our early childhood, and some of their characteristics and the way that they showed love becomes our first prototype of our own way of identifying, choosing, and loving. Identification is the psychological mechanism of adapting characteristics of another person and making them our own. So, identification builds our character. They are our choices. They make us what we are. Our superego is our unconscious voice that demands what we should be and do. But, except our superego voice, let's hear also our ego voice. If you are depressed, find a therapist and search the pieces of yourself that you love and identify with them and live. If you are following someone for his love and you identify yourself with him, just be careful, because this love may lead you to life, but in some cases, like in Heaven's Gate cult, may lead you to death. So live for love and love for life. Thanks for watching this video. Bye.